America and Iran have been enemies for 47 years. Since 1979, when Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, the two nations have not had a single day of normal diplomatic relations. No embassies, no direct flights, no trade. 47 years of sanctions, proxy wars, assassination attempts, nuclear standoffs, and a shooting war that started in February 2026. Right now, today, a deal is on the table. Trump says it's largely negotiated. Iran says the Strait of Hormuz stays under their control. The U.S. military struck Iranian positions yesterday, while the diplomats were still talking. This is the most unstable peace negotiation in the world. And what happens if it actually works will reshape the Middle East, the global economy, and American foreign policy more completely than anything since the end of the Cold War. To understand what a real U.S.-Iran deal means, you first have to understand what the conflict has cost. The war that began on February 28, 2026, when the U.S. and Israel struck Iranian nuclear facilities, has choked the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. Ships have been sitting anchored in the strait, unable to move. Global oil prices have spiked. Every country on Earth that imports oil, which is almost every country on Earth, has been paying that price every day since February. The deal on the table is not just about America and Iran. It is about whether the global economy gets its oil supply back. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point in the global energy system. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It connects the Persian Gulf, where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran produce their oil, to the rest of the world. The deal being negotiated would reopen the strait within 30 days and allow Iran to freely sell its oil again. The moment that happens, the moment the first fully loaded supertanker transits the strait unmolested, global oil prices drop. Not gradually, immediately. The oil market is a futures market that prices anticipated supply months in advance. The announcement of a deal alone, before a single ship moves, will drop oil prices by an estimated 15 to 20% within hours of confirmation. Every American who drives a car, heats a home, or buys anything that was shipped by truck will feel that deal in their wallet within days. The nuclear dimension is the hardest part. The draft agreement includes commitments from Iran to never pursue nuclear weapons and to negotiate over a suspension of its uranium enrichment program and the removal of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. This is the demand that has broken every previous negotiation for 20 years. Iran's position has always been that uranium enrichment is its sovereign right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. America's position has always been that Iranian enrichment is a threat to Israel and regional stability. The 2015 Obama nuclear deal, the JCPOA, temporarily bridged this gap. Trump withdrew from it in 2018. The deal being negotiated now is attempting to bridge the same gap that has been open for 8 years, with a country whose nuclear facilities have just been struck by American and Israeli bombs. That is not a negotiation conducted from positions of equality. It is a negotiation conducted between a country that just bombed the other's most strategic infrastructure and a country that responded by closing the world's most important oil choke point. Both sides hurt each other. Both sides need relief. Day one of a completed deal. The announcement comes simultaneously from Washington and Tehran. Unusual for two countries that don't have diplomatic relations and have been at war for 3 months. The markets react before the politicians finish their statements. Oil futures drop 18% in the first hour of trading. The U.S. stock market opens to its best single day since 2020. Airlines, shipping companies, and logistics firms, whose costs have been inflated by the oil supply disruption, see their stock prices jump. The economic relief is immediate, measurable, and felt by ordinary people within days at the gas pump. This is the most tangible benefit of the deal, and the one that makes it politically survivable in America. Not the geopolitics, not the nuclear question, but the price of gasoline. Week 1. The verification problem begins immediately. The deal requires Iran to allow international inspectors, the International Atomic Energy Agency, back into its nuclear facilities. The IA was expelled from several Iranian sites during the escalation of tensions in 2023 and 2024. Getting inspectors back in requires Iranian cooperation that goes beyond signing a document. It requires Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders, who control the nuclear program and who have spent their careers building it, to open their facilities to foreign inspectors within weeks of those facilities being bombed by American and Israeli aircraft. The political difficulty of that inside Iran is almost impossible to overstate. The supreme leader can sign a deal. Making the Urgi implement it is a different problem entirely. Week 2. Israel's response becomes the first serious threat to the deal's survival. Trump called Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and said the call went very well. But Israel's strategic calculus on Iran has never been aligned with America's. Israel's position has consistently been that any deal that leaves Iran's nuclear infrastructure intact, even under inspection, is insufficient because inspections can be circumvented, facilities can be rebuilt, and a country that has demonstrated the will to build nuclear weapons will find a way to do so, regardless of what it signs. The Israeli security establishment that survived the October 7th attack has a fundamentally different risk tolerance for Iranian nuclear capability than the American administration that is trying to end a war and reduce oil prices. The deal that works for Washington may not work for Tel Aviv. And Israel has demonstrated repeatedly that it is willing to act unilaterally when it believes its survival is at stake. Month 1. The sanctions relief begins partially. Iran would be able to freely sell oil during the 60-day negotiation period, and negotiations would be held on lifting broader sanctions and unfreezing Iranian assets. Iran has approximately $100 billion in frozen assets sitting in banks around the world, money it earned from oil sales before sanctions prevented it from accessing its own funds. The unfreezing of those assets is Iran's primary economic incentive for making any deal. It is also America's primary leverage. The threat of keeping those assets frozen is what keeps Iran at the negotiating table. The moment the assets are unfrozen, that leverage disappears. The sequencing of when Iran gets its money back versus when it implements its nuclear commitments is the detail that will determine whether this deal holds or collapses. And it is exactly the detail that is still unresolved as of today. Month 2, the regional transformation begins to show. A U.S.-Iran deal doesn't just affect America and Iran. It affects every country in the Middle East whose security architecture has been built around the assumption of permanent U.S.-Iran hostility. Saudi Arabia, which has been the primary American ally in the region and the primary regional adversary of Iran, faces a fundamental strategic recalculation. The Saudis spent billions on American weapons to deter Iranian aggression. A deal that normalizes U.S.-Iran relations doesn't eliminate Iranian-Saudi competition. It changes the rules under which that competition operates. The Abraham Accords that normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states were built on a shared threat perception of Iran. A U.S.-Iran deal changes that threat perception and potentially destabilizes the diplomatic architecture that the Abraham Accords created. Month 3. The nuclear negotiation that was supposed to resolve the fundamental issue within 60 days hits its first major deadlock. Iran's position on enrichment has not changed. It insists on the right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. America's position has not changed. It insists on a complete halt to enrichment above civilian grade levels. The 60-day timeline was always optimistic for resolving a disagreement that has persisted for 20 years. The question at month 3 is whether the partial deal, the ceasefire, the open strait, the oil sales, holds while the harder negotiation continues, or whether the failure to resolve the nuclear question within the promised timeline gives hardliners on both sides the justification they need to declare the deal dead and return to confrontation. The Iran deal changes America domestically in ways that foreign policy deals rarely do. The political coalition in America that has supported maximum pressure on Iran, including significant portions of both parties, pro-Israel lobbying groups, and the national security establishment, does not disappear because a deal is signed. It becomes an opposition waiting for the deal to fail. Every IAEA inspection that finds anything ambiguous, every Iranian statement that can be interpreted as defiant, every regional incident that can be connected to Iranian proxies becomes ammunition for the argument that the deal was a mistake and that the pressure campaign should resume. The deals to survive not just Iranian compliance problems, but American domestic politics, which has killed more arms control agreements than Iranian intransigence ever has. Year 1. If the deal holds for a full year, the transformation is significant and measurable. Iranian oil exports return to pre-sanctions levels of approximately 2.5 million barrels per day, adding meaningful supply to global markets and keeping oil prices lower than they would otherwise be. Iran's frozen assets are progressively unfrozen as nuclear commitments are verified, injecting approximately $100 billion into an Iranian economy that has been under severe strain for years. The Iranian middle class, which has been devastated by sanctions and inflation, begins to recover economically. That economic recovery has political implications inside Iran. A population that is experiencing rising living standards has historically been less supportive of confrontational foreign policy than a population that is experiencing economic desperation. The deal that was negotiated to solve a nuclear problem may have its most significant effect on Iranian domestic politics. Year 1 also brings the question that no deal document can answer. What kind of country does Iran become if it is no longer defined by its conflict with America? Iran's Islamic Republic has derived significant legitimacy from its resistance identity, the narrative of a nation standing against American imperialism and Zionist aggression that has justified authoritarian governance, economic mismanagement, and military adventurism for 45 years. A normalized relationship with America doesn't just change Iran's foreign policy. It potentially undermines the ideological foundation of the regime itself. The hardliners within the Iranian system understand this perfectly, which is why they will fight the deal not just because of nuclear concerns, but because normalization threatens everything the revolution stood for. The deal's greatest enemy inside Iran is not military opposition, it is ideological. The scenario where the deal holds, where verification works, where oil flows, where frozen assets are released, where nuclear inspections are accepted, where the 60-day framework extends into a permanent agreement, produces a Middle East that looks genuinely different from the one that has existed since 1979. Not peaceful. The region's conflicts are too deep and too varied to be resolved by one bilateral agreement, but different. An Iran that is economically integrated into the global system has different incentives than an Iran that is isolated by sanctions. An Iran that has diplomatic relations with America has different options than an Iran whose only great power patron is Russia and China. The deal doesn't solve the Middle East. It changes the conditions under which the Middle East's problems get addressed. That is not nothing. It is not everything. It is the most that any deal can do. The scenario where the deal collapses, which is the more historically likely scenario given the track record of US-Iran diplomacy, produces something worse than the situation before the deal was attempted. Failed deals don't return situations to the status quo. They return them to a status quo, plus the grievances generated by the failure. Iran's nuclear program, if negotiations collapse, will restart from a position of knowledge gained during the negotiation about exactly what America's red lines are and how far they can be pushed. America's sanctions, if re-imposed after a failed deal, face a global community that is more skeptical of their effectiveness after watching them fail to produce a durable agreement. The hardliners who opposed the deal in both countries get to say they were right, and the next negotiation, if there is one, starts from a more hostile baseline than this one did. The US-Iran deal, if it works, is not the story of two governments solving a problem. It is the story of two societies, one that has been told for 47 years that the other is an existential enemy, and one that has been told for 47 years that the other is the great Satan. Deciding that the story they were told is no longer the story they want to live. Deals between governments are easy compared to that. A piece of paper can reopen the Strait of Hormuz in 30 days. Changing what Americans think about Iran and what Iranians think about America takes a generation. The deal being negotiated right now is the beginning of a process that will outlast every person in the room where it is being signed. Whether it works depends not on the document but on whether both societies decide, slowly, imperfectly, with many setbacks, that the enemy they were given is one they are willing to put down. Subscribe, because the next scenario is what happens if they don't.